On the morning of September 21st, 1921, in a small industrial town in southwestern Germany called Oppau, a crew of workers carried dynamite into a fertilizer silo. This was routine. The plant stored thousands of tons of ammonium sulfate nitrate, and the stuff had an irritating habit of absorbing moisture and hardening into a single solid mass like a mountain of concrete. You could not shovel it out. So the workers did what they had done an estimated 20,000 times before. They drilled small holes into the hardened fertilizer, packed in small explosive charges, and blasted it loose. 20,000 detonations, give or take, without a single disaster. At around 7:30 that morning, they fired another charge. This time, the silo answered back. Hundreds of tons of fertilizer detonated at once. The explosion tore the factory apart and flattened much of the town around it. More than 500 people were killed. Around 2,000 were injured. Where the storage building had stood, there was now a crater roughly 90 meters wide and 20 meters deep, slowly filling with groundwater. The blast shattered windows more than 25 kilometers away, and the sound was heard in Munich, some 300 kilometers from Oppau. And here is the thing. The material that did this was not a weapon. It was not leftover ammunition from the war that had ended 3 years earlier. It was fertilizer, manufactured for one purpose: to make wheat grow heavier and fields produce more so that people would not go hungry. The same family of chemicals, it turns out, can feed a field or erase a town. And that contradiction sits at the center of one of the most important and least told stories in human history. Because today, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer supports the food supply of roughly half the people on Earth. Not helps, supports. Remove it, and by the most careful scientific estimates, about every second person alive right now could not be fed. There is a genuine possibility that you exist because of this chemical. So how did something farmers once shoveled out of barns become one of the most powerful technologies ever created? Powerful enough to feed billions and dangerous enough to level a town before breakfast? The answer starts thousands of years before Oppau, with a problem buried underneath every civilization that has ever existed. Plants do not grow from sunlight and water alone. They need nutrients pulled up through their roots, and above all, they need 3 of them: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Every time humans harvest a field of wheat or rice or corn, they are not just collecting food, they are physically removing those nutrients from the land. Cart the harvest away, return nothing, and the soil gets a little poorer. Do it year after year, and eventually the land stops feeding the people standing on it. Ancient farmers had no idea what a nitrogen atom was, but they knew the pattern by heart. A fresh field produced fat harvests for a few seasons. Then the grain came in smaller, the stalks grew weaker, and a family that had eaten well for a generation suddenly found itself clearing new land or going hungry. So every civilization on Earth developed workarounds. Farmers spread animal manure across their fields and dug wood ash into the soil. Roman writers described plowing lupines and beans back into the ground because grain simply grew better afterward, though nobody could say why. In China and Japan, human waste was so valuable as fertilizer that collectors bought it from city households and hauled it out to the countryside. It even had a polite commercial name: night soil. In Egypt, the Nile did the work all by itself, flooding every year and leaving a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt across the fields. Egyptian agriculture ran on that annual delivery for thousands of years. And when all else failed, farmers simply let fields rest, sometimes for years, waiting for fertility to creep back on its own. These systems worked. Some of them worked brilliantly, but every single one of them shared the same hidden ceiling. None of them created fertility. They moved it. Manure is just grass and grain passing through an animal. Night soil is last month's harvest passing through a city. The Nile's silt was topsoil washed off the highlands of Ethiopia. A farmer could shuffle nutrients from one patch of the Earth's surface to another, but no one, anywhere, could make more. And as cities grew, the arithmetic turned ugly. Food flowed from the countryside into London, Paris, and Rome, carrying its nutrients with it. The people ate. And then the waste, instead of returning to the fields it came from, washed into streets, rivers, and out to sea. Every loaf of bread eaten in a great city was a small withdrawal from some distant field's account, and the deposit ended up on the bottom of the ocean. For thousands of years, humanity did not know how to create fertile soil. It only knew how to move fertility around, and it was slowly running out of places to take it from. Nobody could fix this problem, because nobody could even say what fertility was. Into the early 19th century, most European farmers treated soil the way you might treat luck. Some earth was good, some earth was tired. Old men judged a field by its smell and its color, and explanations tended to involve tradition, instinct, or God. Then a German chemist decided that dirt was chemistry. His name was Justus von Liebig, and in 1840 he published a book on agriculture that landed like a bomb in the farming world. Plants, Liebig argued, feed on specific mineral elements. A harvest removes those elements from the soil. Fertility is not a mood or a blessing, it is an inventory. From this came the principle he made famous, the law of the minimum. A crop's growth is not controlled by the total richness of the soil. It is controlled by whichever essential nutrient is in shortest supply. Picture a wooden barrel with one short stave. It does not matter how tall the other staves are, the water pours out at the lowest one. A field can be loaded with potassium and phosphorus, but if it lacks usable nitrogen, growth stops, period. This changed the entire question. A farmer no longer had to ask, "Is my land good?" He could ask, "What exactly is my land missing?" And a missing chemical is something you can go and get. Liebig himself tried to cash in and failed. His early commercial fertilizer was formulated so poorly that the nutrients barely dissolved and crops ignored it. The product flopped. The idea did not. Soil was now a bank account, every harvest a withdrawal, and every serious farmer suddenly needed a way to make deposits, which kicked off a global race to find the most concentrated deposits of plant food on the planet. And the richest one ever discovered was sitting on a few rainless islands off the coast of Peru, stacked in cliffs 100 feet high, under clouds of screaming seabirds. It was bird droppings. For centuries, seabirds had nested on the Chincha Islands, and because it almost never rains there, their droppings never washed away. They just piled up, decade after decade, century after century, into mountains of guano dozens of meters deep. And guano is not ordinary manure. Concentrated and dried, it carries many times the nitrogen. Spread on the exhausted fields of Europe, it worked like sorcery. Yields jumped, word spread. By the 1840s and 50s, guano had become one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. Peru's government was living off bird droppings, which at their peak provided the majority of its revenue. Britain imported hundreds of thousands of tons. The United States wanted in so badly that in 1856 Congress passed the Guano Islands Act, a law allowing any American citizen to claim any unclaimed guano island anywhere in the world for the United States. Dozens of specks of rock in the Pacific and Caribbean were annexed under it. That law is technically still on the books today. Meanwhile, the men actually digging the guano, many of them Chinese indentured laborers, worked in ammonia-choked air under conditions that visitors compared to a death sentence. This channel has told the full guano story before, so here the point is a simple one, and it is the hinge of everything that follows. The world's first industrial fertilizer boom did not create fertility either. It mined fertility that seabirds had spent centuries accumulating, and it burned through the richest deposits within a few decades. So attention swung south to the Atacama Desert, where the ground held something even stranger, vast beds of sodium nitrate, white gold. Nitrate could feed a wheat field. It could also be turned into gunpowder and industrial explosives, which meant nations did not merely want it. They needed it, in the way they needed steel and coal. In 1879, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia went to war over the nitrate territories. Chile won, Bolivia lost its entire coastline, and has been a landlocked country ever since, over fertilizer. By the end of the 19th century, the industrial world could see the shape of its own trap. The guano was nearly gone, the nitrate was finite, and it sat in one desert on one continent, reachable only by ship, blockadable by any serious navy. And the population curves only pointed up, which set the stage for one of the most famous warnings in the history of science. Exactly a century earlier, in 1798, an English clergyman named Thomas Malthus had published the essay that made his name a permanent insult. Population, he argued, multiplies faster than food. Push far enough, and the correction arrives on its own, as famine, disease, and war. For most of the 19th century he looked wrong. New farmland opened in the American plains, in Argentina, in Ukraine. Guano and nitrate pushed yields up. Steamships moved grain across oceans. The doom kept getting postponed. Then, in 1898, the chemist and physicist Sir William Crookes stood up as president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science and told his audience the postponements were about to run out. The wheat-eating nations, he calculated, were heading for shortage within a generation. The good land was taken. The Chilean nitrate would not last. His conclusion became one of the most quoted lines in the history of chemistry. It is the chemist who must come to the rescue. It is through the laboratory that starvation may ultimately be turned into plenty. And here is the cruel joke buried in that speech. The substance everyone was fighting over, digging islands apart for, going to war for, was floating right in front of every face in that lecture hall. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere. Nearly 4/5 of every breath you have ever taken. Thousands of tons of it drift above every field on Earth, free, endless, everywhere, and completely useless. Because atmospheric nitrogen comes as two atoms locked together by a triple bond, one of the strongest in nature. Plants cannot break it. Almost nothing can. Lightning cracks a little open. A few specialized microbes, including the ones living on the roots of beans and clover, manage the trick quietly in the soil, which is why farmers had always noticed that legumes refreshed a field. But that was it. Those were the only keys in existence. Humanity was starving inside a sealed room full of food, staring at it through unbreakable glass. Crookes had issued a public challenge to the chemists of the world: break the glass. In Germany, one man took it personally. His name was Fritz Haber. He was brilliant, restless, and patriotic to the point of obsession, the son of a Jewish dye merchant who had converted to Christianity, partly because he understood exactly how far a Jew could rise in Imperial Germany, and he intended to rise further. By the early 1900s, he was a professor at Karlsruhe, hunting a reaction most of his colleagues considered a commercial dead end, forcing nitrogen from the air to combine with hydrogen to make ammonia. Ammonia is nitrogen in a form life can use. Crack that, and the glass room opens. On paper, it is the simplest reaction imaginable. Nitrogen plus hydrogen gives ammonia. In practice, the nitrogen bond simply refuses. You need brutal temperatures and pressures around 200 times the atmosphere, and a catalyst willing to survive both. And in the early 1900s, no industrial equipment on Earth operated anywhere near those conditions. A rival, the great chemist Walther Nernst, ran the numbers, told Haber his yields were wrong, and dismissed the whole approach. The humiliation seems to have worked on Haber like fuel. On July 2, 1909, in his Karlsruhe laboratory, Haber and his assistant Robert Le Rossignol switched on a tabletop apparatus of steel and brass, and out came ammonia. Not a puff, a steady, continuous trickle of liquid ammonia, hour after hour, made from air. Representatives of BASF, the giant German chemical company, were there to watch it drip. One problem solved, a much bigger one created. A machine on a bench is not an industry, and the man Bass F. handed that problem to was an engineer named Karl Bosch. Bosch's task has a fair claim to being the hardest industrial engineering project attempted up to that point. Nothing existed that could hold the reaction. At 200 atmospheres and several hundred degrees, hydrogen seeps into steel, attacks the carbon inside it, and turns the vessel brittle until it bursts. Early reactors failed. Some exploded. Bosch redesigned the reactor with an ingenious double wall that let hydrogen bleed harmlessly through an inner liner while an outer shell carried the pressure. His chemist Alwin Mittisch, hunting a catalyst cheaper than Haber's osmium, ran a testing program of legendary stubbornness, thousands of catalyst recipes across roughly 20,000 experiments before settling on iron laced with trace promoters. Compressors, valves, gauges, entire categories of high-pressure equipment had to be invented from nothing. It took 4 years. In September 1913, BASF's first full-scale ammonia plant came online and began turning air into fertilizer by the ton. The plant was at Oppau. Yes, that Oppau. The town that gets blown off the map in the opening of this story is the birthplace of synthetic fertilizer, the first place on Earth where human beings manufactured the stuff of life out of the sky. Hold that thought, because we are coming back to it. Understand the size of this moment. For roughly 10,000 years since the first farmer scratched the first furrow, the amount of food on Earth had been capped by the amount of nitrogen nature happened to hand over. The manure pile, the flooded river, the lightning strike, the bean field. Every empire that ever existed lived under that ceiling. In September 1913, the ceiling cracked. Crooks had begged the laboratory to rescue humanity by the 1930s. The rescue arrived almost 2 decades early, and within 11 months, the machine built to feed people was feeding something else entirely. In August 1914, the First World War began, and modern war turned out to run on the exact same element as bread. Every artillery shell, every cartridge, every kilogram of high explosive requires fixed nitrogen. Germany, like everyone else, got its nitrate from Chile, and Britain had the world's largest navy. The blockade closed. After the Royal Navy destroyed Germany's Pacific Squadron off the Falklands in December 1914, the nitrate route was finished, and Allied planners could do the arithmetic. German ammunition should run out within roughly a year. The war should strangle itself. It did not. Because Germany had Haber-Bosch. Synthetic ammonia can be oxidized into nitric acid, and nitric acid is the doorway to military explosives. BASF's fertilizer works were converted, and a second colossal plant rose at Lina. The reactors built to end hunger kept the German army firing for 4 more years. Historians still argue over the numbers, but the grim consensus is that the Haber-Bosch process materially prolonged the First World War, and millions of the war's deaths sit inside that extension. Haber himself did not merely accept this, he threw himself into it. In peacetime, he liked to say, a scientist belongs to the world, but in wartime he belongs to his country, and he went much further than ammonia. Haber personally championed and organized Germany's chemical weapons program, and on April 22, 1915, at Ypres in Belgium, he was there in person, supervising as nearly 6,000 cylinders released around 168 tons of chlorine gas into the wind. The greenish-yellow cloud rolled across the French and Algerian trenches and turned the air itself into a weapon. Thousands of men drowned standing up, their lungs filling with fluid. It was the birth of modern chemical warfare, and its father was the same man who had learned to pull bread from the sky. 9 days later, his wife was dead. Clara Immerwahr was a chemist herself, the first woman ever to earn a doctorate in chemistry at the University of Breslau, and she had watched her husband turn their science into this. She called it a perversion of everything the discipline was for. On the night of May 2, 1915, days after Haber returned from Ypres celebrating his promotion to captain, Clara took his army pistol into the garden and shot herself in the chest. She died in the arms of their 13-year-old son, Hermann. The next morning, Fritz Haber left for the Eastern Front to oversee gas attacks against the Russians. In 1918, Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the synthesis of ammonia. Scientists in Allied countries protested that a war criminal was being honored. The committee's reasoning was cold and defensible at the same time. Whatever else the man had done, this single reaction would feed the world. And history was not finished with Fritz Haber. In 1933, the Nazis came to power, and the man who had armed the Kaiser's Germany, gassed its enemies, and given it bread from the air, discovered that none of it counted because he had been born a Jew. Forced out of the institute he had built, he left Germany, broken and ill, and died in a Basel hotel room in January 1934. And the story finds its blackest turn after his death. In the 1920s, researchers connected to Haber's own institute had developed a cyanide-based pesticide called Zyklon. A modified version of it, Zyklon B, became the gas of the extermination camps. Among its victims were members of Haber's own extended family. The chemistry never chose a side. Ammonia becomes bread. Ammonia becomes bombs. The molecule is identical in both directions, and everything depends on whose hands it passes through. No novelist would dare invent Fritz Haber. History did. But before this story leaves Germany, there is a debt to settle with a town you already know. After the war, the Oppau plant went back to doing what it was built for, making fertilizer. Thousands of tons of ammonium sulfate nitrate that kept absorbing moisture and setting hard in the silos. The dynamite routine resumed. Tests said the mixture could not detonate. 20,000 blasts said the same thing. And then, on that September morning in 1921, blast number 20,000 and something found a pocket of material whose composition had drifted, ever so slightly, into a range nobody knew was lethal. Here is the detail that did not make it into the opening of this video. The silo held roughly 4,500 tons of fertilizer. Only about a tenth of it actually detonated. 1/10 was enough to kill more than 500 people, injure 2,000, and dig a crater the size of a city block. If the entire mass had gone up, Oppau would simply have ceased to exist, and the destruction would have reached deep into the cities around it. And the world did not learn the lesson, because a century of repetition suggests the lesson may not be fully learnable. In 1947, in Texas City, a cargo ship loaded with ammonium nitrate fertilizer caught fire in the harbor and exploded, killing nearly 600 people, still the deadliest industrial accident in American history. In 2020, some 2,750 tons of confiscated ammonium nitrate that had sat in a Beirut warehouse for 6 years went up in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded, killing more than 200 people, filmed from 100 phones across the city. A full century after Oppau, same compound, same energy, waiting. We have never made this substance safe. We have only managed it. And yet, after 1921, after 1947, after every disaster since, production of synthetic nitrogen did not slow down. It accelerated, decade over decade, because whatever this chemistry could destroy, the world needed what it could build far too badly to stop. What happened next is the reason you are probably alive. After the Second World War, the great munitions plants faced a choice. The United States alone had built enormous ammonia capacity to feed its bomb factories, and in 1945, the bombs stopped. The reactors did not. They pivoted back to the purpose Haber had first imagined, and synthetic nitrogen began pouring into agriculture in quantities no previous generation of farmers could have dreamed of. Prices fell, supply exploded. For the first time in history, an ordinary farmer could buy more plant food than his ancestors could have collected from every barn in the province. And then something almost comical happened. The crops said no. Traditional wheat and rice had evolved and been bred for a stingy world. Feed them lavish nitrogen, and they responded by growing tall, lush, and top-heavy, magnificent right up until the grain heads filled out. at which point the long, slender stalks buckled and the whole field fell flat. Farmers call it lodging, and a lodged field rots on the ground. Humanity had built a fire hose of fertility and was aiming it at plants engineered for a drip. The fuel had outrun the engine. To use manufactured fertility, the world needed crops physically redesigned to drink it. That redesign has a name, and the name has a face: a stubborn plant scientist from an Iowa farm. Norman Borlaug arrived in Mexico in 1944, working for a Rockefeller Foundation program with an unglamorous mission: help Mexican farmers whose wheat harvests were being eaten alive by a fungal disease called stem rust in a country importing much of its bread. Borlaug spent years making thousands upon thousands of crosses, hunting rust resistance. He broke the rules of his own field by running 2 breeding seasons a year in 2 different climates, shuttling seed between highlands and lowlands, which the textbooks said would fail and which instead produced varieties that thrived almost anywhere. Then came the masterstroke. Borlaug crossed his rust-resistant wheats with a Japanese dwarf variety called Norin 10, and out came something new: semi-dwarf wheat, short, thick-stemmed. A plant that, when you drowned it in fertilizer, did not shoot upward and collapse, but poured all that nitrogen into grain. Heavy heads on stalks like fence posts. Yields did not inch up, they doubled, then tripled. By 1956, Mexico, the wheat importer, was growing all the wheat it needed. Meanwhile, South Asia was sliding toward the abyss on schedule. Back-to-back droughts in the mid-1960s left India surviving on emergency shipments of American grain, and the expert consensus turned openly apocalyptic. In 1968, biologist Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb and declared the battle to feed humanity already lost, with hundreds of millions certain to starve within the decade. India, in the fashionable analysis of the time, was a country to be written off. Instead, India and Pakistan planted Borlaug's wheat. In 1966, India ordered 18,000 tons of the new seed, one of the largest seed purchases in history, and imported fertilizer alongside it, plus irrigation, crop credit, and guaranteed prices to make it all worth a farmer's risk. The harvests that followed broke every record on the books, so far beyond expectations that in some regions schools were closed so the buildings could be used to store grain. Pakistan was self-sufficient in wheat by 1968. India followed within a few years, and rice went through the same revolution. In 1966, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines released IR8, a semi-dwarf rice the newspapers called miracle rice, which under fertilizer and irrigation produced several times the yield of the traditional varieties it replaced. Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and he is routinely credited with saving more lives than any other human being who ever lived, with estimates reaching 1 billion. He spent the rest of his life pointing out, correctly, that his wheat was one gear in a larger machine of seeds, water, roads, credit, and chemistry. But strip the green revolution down to its engine, and you find one thing above all: Haber-Bosch nitrogen, flowing through crops finely built to absorb it. If you're finding this story worth your time, hit subscribe. New videos on the hidden forces behind history drop every week. Because here is what the Green Revolution actually did beneath the headlines. The mass famines predicted for the 1970s and 80s largely never arrived, and quietly, in the background, the oldest number in the human story came unmoored. World population was about 1.6 billion in 1900, 3 billion by 1960, 6 billion by 2000, more than 8 billion today. Growth on that scale had never happened before in the entire existence of our species, and it was not magic. Every one of those additional mouths was being fed, calorie by calorie, from somewhere. So let's name the somewhere precisely. Scientists who study the global nitrogen cycle, among them Vaclav Smil, who has spent much of his career on exactly this question, estimate that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer currently sustains the food supply of roughly half the world's population, around 4 billion people. The number cannot be perfectly exact because food systems are tangled and dependence varies by crop and country. But the core conclusion has survived every serious attempt to knock it down. With today's crops and today's farmland, a world without Haber-Bosch is a world that feeds perhaps 4 billion people. There are more than 8 billion of us. Make that personal. Picture a packed stadium, 80,000 seats, now empty every second seat. Do the same to your street, your family. The exact accounting is unknowable, but the scale is real, and you may not be sitting in one of the lucky seats. And trace, just once, the supply chain hiding inside a sandwich. A natural gas well feeds an ammonia reactor running at pressures found nowhere else in ordinary life. The ammonia becomes urea. The urea rides a bulk carrier across an ocean, then a freight train, then a spreader truck fanning it across a wheat field. The wheat becomes flour. The flour becomes bread. The bread is in your hand. We say food comes from farms, and it does. But a real fraction of it begins in a chemical plant, and the plant began as air. Something like 1 to 2% of all the energy humanity uses goes into making ammonia. It is invisible infrastructure, as fundamental as electricity or clean water. And like them, it gets noticed on the one occasion that matters, when it stops. In 2021, the world got a preview of it stopping. Modern ammonia gets its hydrogen overwhelmingly from natural gas, and gas can account for the large majority of the cost of making nitrogen fertilizer. So when gas prices went vertical after the pandemic, and then Russia, itself one of the world's largest fertilizer exporters, invaded Ukraine, the chain reaction was textbook. Ammonia plants across Europe shut down because the gas cost more than the fertilizer was worth. Fertilizer prices tripled and quadrupled. Farmers from Brazil to Kenya to India cut back or were priced out entirely. Harvests thinned, and food prices climbed across the planet, hitting hardest in the poorest places. A pipeline dispute in Europe moved the price of bread in Cairo. This is the fine print of the miracle, and it is the thesis of this entire story. Haber and Bosch did not abolish the ancient limit on food. They relocated it. Humanity escaped its dependence on a few guano islands and one Chilean desert, and became dependent instead on gas fields, on phosphate mines, with Morocco sitting on roughly 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves, on potash from Russia, Belarus, and Canada, on shipping lanes and sanctions and the politics of a dozen governments. The ceiling still exists. We rebuilt it out of pipelines and cargo ships, and it can still come down, and there is a second bill arriving, because the miracle leaks. Of all the nitrogen spread onto the world's fields, only around half ever makes it into a crop. The rest escapes, washing into groundwater, running off into rivers, drifting into the air, and reactive nitrogen does not stop being reactive just because it missed the wheat. In water, it feeds explosions of algae. The algae die, decompose, and the decomposition strips the oxygen out of the water until fish either flee or suffocate. The result is called a dead zone, and the one that forms in the Gulf of Mexico each summer, fed by fertilizer draining off the American Midwest down the Mississippi, has in bad years covered an area the size of New Jersey. Hundreds of these zones now pulse in coastal waters around the world. Nitrates seep into drinking water, and soils dosed with nitrogen breathe out nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas roughly 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and now the biggest remaining threat to the ozone layer. Notice that this is not a separate scandal bolted onto the fertilizer story. It is the same property running in both directions. The reactivity that lets nitrogen build protein in a wheat kernel is exactly what lets it strangle a river. When it lands in the crop, it is food. When it misses, it is poison. You cannot have the first without risking the second. So why not simply stop? One country recently tried. In 2021, Sri Lanka banned synthetic fertilizer imports essentially overnight, aiming to go fully organic. Rice yields collapsed within a single season, the tea exports that earned the country's foreign currency crumbled, and food shortages helped push the economy into a crisis that ended with protesters inside the presidential palace and the president fleeing the country. That was one small nation, farming some of the most fertile land in Asia for 1 year. Now scale the experiment to a planet where every second person is eating Haber-Bosch nitrogen. Stopping is not the option. Aiming better is. Globally, the problem is not exactly that we use too much fertilizer. It is that we use it in the wrong amounts, in the wrong places. Parts of China and Europe apply so much that fields could lose a fifth of their dose without losing a kilogram of harvest. Meanwhile, farmers across much of sub-Saharan Africa apply a small fraction of the world average and watch their soils and their children's prospects run down for the lack of it. The fixes exist and are unglamorous. Sensors and satellites that tell a farmer exactly what a field needs, coated fertilizers that release slowly instead of washing away, crops bred to waste less, legumes rotated back into the system doing the microbe trick farmers knew before anyone knew why, and ammonia plants that split hydrogen from water with clean electricity instead of pulling it from gas. Whether all that scales fast enough is one of the genuinely open questions of this century, and it is being decided right now, mostly by people who have never heard the name Fritz Haber. Go back to Oppau one last time. The crater is long gone, filled in, built over. The town is a district of Ludwigshafen now, and BASF's chemical works still sprawl along the Rhine where the first reactors ran. A century later, the machines are still there, still turning air into the thing that keeps us here. For 10,000 years, the size of humanity was set by nitrogen nature happened to hand over a manure pile, a flooding river, a field of beans. Every civilization lived inside that ceiling, and most of them died without ever knowing it was there. Then, inside a German laboratory, in a steel tube no bigger than a person, we learned to snap the strongest common bond in nature and pour the atmosphere itself onto our fields. We did not create food from nothing. We learned to manufacture one of its ingredients from the sky, and the modern world, its 8 billion people, its megacities, its full supermarkets, and its dead rivers, is what followed. And here is the part that is hard to stop thinking about once you know it. The nitrogen in fertilizer becomes the nitrogen in wheat, and the nitrogen in wheat becomes the nitrogen in you. It is in your muscles right now, in your DNA, in the neurotransmitters firing as you listen to this sentence. Scientists estimate that around half the nitrogen atoms in the average human body passed through an ammonia reactor on their way to becoming part of a person. You do not merely eat this invention, you are partly made of it. If this story changed the way you look at something as boring as a bag of fertilizer, hit subscribe and leave a comment with the one fact you will not be able to stop telling people, because there are more hidden foundations of the modern world where this came from. Your body is carrying atoms that were drifting in the open sky not so long ago, until a machine first switched on in 1913 reached up and pulled them down into bread, and the bread became you. Half the world exists because that machine keeps running. It has not stopped for a single day since.